So I love personality tests. I think they're really interesting, and I know that some of them are silly and have no basis in reality, and some are overused. But the one that I am most interested in right now, and that has been a really useful tool for me both personally and professionally, is the Enneagram. Now, disclaimer, if you're not familiar with the Enneagram and you want to find out more, I recommend the Enneagram Institute website. And you can read the descriptions of the different types and figure out which one you are. Don't take an online test. They're not accurate. They're not going to tell you anything. Read the descriptions of the types and figure out which one is really like convicting you and really speaking to you. And that's how you'll know. But so I'm really interested in the Enneagram, and what it's about, what it is structured around, is uncovering and working with what some of your biggest fears are, some of your root fears in your life, and then also how those motivate you and the ways that you are more or less healthy at different times in your life based on those fears and those motivations, and also how to be a more emotionally healthy person, how to have more emotionally healthy relationships, whatever kind of relationships those are. And what I've noticed, the more I read about the Enneagram, the more I read about different types and meet people who are different types, is that almost all of the types go back to that we are seeking love and security. That at some point in our lives, we had to adapt to a wound that we had, where we didn't receive that love and security in a way that made sense for us. So, for example, Enneagram type 1, which is what I am, tries to earn love by being perfect, by being really ethically sound, by doing the right thing all the time, by being a good person. And that if you're a really good person, then you can deserve and earn love. Whereas type 3 goes about trying to earn love by succeeding, by being the best at something, by being really accomplished. Enneagram type 2 does it by loving and serving others, that if they can really love and serve others, then maybe they'll be loved back. Type 9 goes about that by just merging with other people, by never making a ruckus, by being super easygoing and not having any needs of their own. Type 5 does it by mastery of a subject, by being secure in their understanding of the world. And in some way, the hard work of all of these types, and I didn't name all of them, but the hard work in all of these types is countering whatever that fear and whatever that motivation is by doing kind of the opposite of what you would normally do. So again, for me, for type 1 who's a perfectionist, I have to let go of that perfectionism. I have to be a little bit messy, a little bit unplanned, a little bit more spontaneous, and discover in that even in the messiness of my humanity, in not being perfect all the time, that I still can be loved. And so for each type on the Enneagram, ultimately that journey to greater health is about rediscovering and going back to grace. In our reading from Romans today, Paul is kind of at the beginning, the middle of the beginning of this large argument that he is making towards the churches in Rome about trying to get them to understand how God is redeeming the world and how they are part of it and who else is part of it. And Romans is an incredibly deep and complex book of the Bible. It's long. The theology is really rich. There is so much to unpack in the complexity of the arguments and the rhetoric that Paul makes in the book of Romans. And in this particular passage in chapter 3, what Paul is doing is he's using the understanding of the Jewish parts of the church, of Abraham. So he's speaking to his fellow Jewish kindred. And he's teaching them about how there is continuity in God's grace. There's continuity from God's action with Abraham, how Abraham lived not under the law that they understood and yet was still able to access righteousness, and how that continues and has culminated in Jesus Christ, and how the circle is drawn wide because of this action that God takes through Jesus Christ. And ultimately, what Paul's argument comes down to in this section and continuing on is that righteousness comes down to faith. But it's not our faith. It's God's faith. What's underlying Paul's understanding of how God is redeeming the world is that God continues to be faithful to us. Another way that we might talk about this is that God continues to extend grace to us. No matter whether we obey the law or whether we fall short, whether we have lived and known the law or whether we have been outside it, God has continued to be faithful. God has continued to seek and work out justice. It's God's righteousness that is at work here. It is God setting the world to right through the faithful, covenanted relationship that, according to Paul, is now blown wide open and is available to Jews and Gentiles alike. Paul's understanding of God's righteousness is that truly it is that God is the one in control. That righteousness comes down to God's action, God's justice, God's work in the world. And it's neither our obedience to law, nor even our individual faith or our affirmations of faith or our statements of faith or our assent to faith that actually accomplishes this. It's God's faithfulness. It's God holding fast to these promises of justice and restoration and setting things to right. So contrast that message, that there's actually not a lot that we can do, to the messages that we get in the world, to the messages that have infiltrated all of us, whether in early childhood or as teenagers, as our personalities are developing, that at some point we have all been told that we have to do something to be loved, to be good enough. We have to earn love. We have to change who we are. There's something deficient about us, and so we better work a little bit harder. Contrast that message that we have all gotten and all internalized in different ways to what Paul is really saying here. It's not about what we can do. It's not about our action at all. It's solely dependent on God. We've been told that we have to earn everything, that we have to work ourselves to death or that we deserve to suffer, that we have to live totally ethically and uprightly in order, or else we are the problem in the world. Imagine our surprise when we really discover that the world being set to right, that our access to that righteousness, that us being part of that way that God is resetting everything, our access to God's loving action in the world isn't dependent on us at all. It's shocking. It's shocking that basically we're just being asked to trust God, to have faith that God is indeed faithful to us, and that it's nothing that we can accomplish, and that it's way more about living lives that are grace-filled because we have accepted the reality of grace. We have come to know that God is setting things right because God is faithful, not because we are. That maybe is even a contrast and a surprise to how we think about our faith right now. A lot of American Protestantism is about us earning our salvation by saying the right words, by doing the right things, by making a promise to God that activates God's goodness in our lives. But that's not what Paul is saying. And God's goodness is not based on us saying the right words or making the right promise back. God is redeeming the world because of who God is, because of God's faithfulness to us, whether we are faithful or not. Now, this is a shift in how we have to live. Now, you could take it one way and say, well, I don't need to do anything. There's no response I could possibly have. God is doing God's thing, and so I just can kick back. But that's not it. When we realize the reality, when we realize the truth of how God reacts to us, of how God has been operating in the world, of God's faithfulness to us throughout everything, that causes a shift in us. It causes us not to realize that we have to work out our own salvation, but that really we have to live a grace-filled life because we are suddenly consumed by it. And that we can let go of a lot of our striving and a lot of our worry because it's really not about us at all. That's the kind of faith that Paul's talking about. And even the disciples that we encounter in Mark 8 are struggling with this kind of faithful living. In this passage, Jesus is kind of giving them a lowdown of what his messiahship means. He's been declared the Messiah by them. And Peter clearly seems to struggle with that. When Jesus starts telling him what's going to happen, that he has to suffer and die. And Jesus rejects Peter's concerns, rejects Peter's own rejection of this idea that Jesus will suffer and die. Because Jesus is teaching them that his messiahship doesn't mean glory, it doesn't mean the kind of anointing that they want, but it actually means a shameful, intentionally public death. When the disciples call Jesus anointed, which is what they mean when they call him Messiah, he immediately starts talking about how following him, following Jesus, means that the disciples and us have to decenter ourselves, that we have to die to self to live again, and we have to take up our crosses. So I wonder, what if part of dying to ourself and taking up our cross actually means really trusting, really having faith, really believing that God is loving and faithful regardless of what we do? What if that's the part of ourselves we have to die to? What if that death is us acknowledging how powerless we are to earn God's faithful love? And what if taking up our cross is really about breaking our addiction to worldly praise, breaking our addiction to the little glimpses of fame and accolades that we get on this earth from authority? And instead, we're asked to carry this symbol of what was at the time shame, this symbol that we have given up everything, that we have acknowledged that there is no more self to us. What if it's about accepting that there's no pat on the back for how hard we believe in the righteousness of God, that there's no authority that's going to see the setting of things to right and congratulate us? And in fact, what if it's actually that we know we're going to get into trouble? Because when God starts setting things to right, it's going to upturn a lot of those powers and principalities that we're secretly looking to for praise. I think an example of this kind of foolishness, this kind of ridding ourselves of our own good works, not that we don't do them, but that we no longer see them as about ourselves, that we're no longer secretly striving to earn our salvation. What if that kind of foolishness looks a little bit like when we just give someone money because they asked us. There's no glory to that. There's no pat on the back for offering that dollar. There are actually many people who would tell us that our behavior is bad in doing that. That we can't control how they're going to use that money, that when that person in need asks us. There's plenty of people that would tell us that that act is foolish, that we're enabling some kind of behavior. And there's certainly no way for us to get credit for it or deduct it on our taxes. That act of faith requires us to truly believe that in that moment, God is going to change something, whether it's small or large. That in that single act of generosity, that foolish act of generosity, that maybe just in that one moment, maybe just in that act of kindness, that God is setting something to right where there was suffering before. Our understanding of righteousness has to go back to faith. Not faith as intellectual assent. Not faith as in believing that we can change things, but faith that truly trusts that we can't do anything. That the world changing, the world being set to right, is about what God is doing, is based in God's faithfulness, is based in God's righteousness, is based in the ongoing work of God working out justice, of God bringing more and more people into that presence of loving kindness, and actually believing that something has changed, and something is changing, and something will change because of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. So your homework this week around this idea of our powerlessness and God's righteousness is to take some time and really evaluate how much you really, truly, deeply trust that it's God setting things to right, that it's God who is faithful, that it's God who is righteous and acting out of that faithful righteousness. And also evaluating how much you secretly think it's you. And then give some of that up. Give it up through prayer. Give it up through the giving of alms. But release some of that need to work out your own salvation, to earn your own grace, and live instead, maybe just for a moment, a life that is truly grace-filled. Amen.